Now, in a few moments, I am going to read the next verses in the same chapter that we looked at in the first hour. That is John chapter 3, but picking up from verse 16. But before we do that, I want to talk a little more generally about love of God. For if there is one thing that our world thinks it knows about God, if our world believes in God at all, is that He's a loving God. That has not always been the case in human history. Many people have thought of the gods as pretty arbitrary, mean-spirited, and malicious. That's why you have to placate them. And sometimes in the history of the church, there has been more emphasis on God's terror, or His sovereignty, or His holiness, all of which themes are biblical in some degree or another, some massively so, than on His love. But today, if people believe in God at all, they find it, by and large, easy to believe in God's love. Yet with this being comfortable with the notion of the love of God has also come some fairly spongy notions of what love means. So occasionally you'll find somebody saying, it's Christians I don't like. I mean, God is love, and if everybody were just like Jesus, it would be wonderful. Jesus said, judge not that you be not judged. Do you know, if we could all just be non-judgmental and loving the way Jesus is loving, then the world would be a better place. But those Christians, they're so mean. Now, there's a certain kind of assumption there about the nature of love, isn't there? It's non-judgmental, doesn't condemn anybody, lets everybody do whatever they want, and that's what love means. And it's true that sometimes Christians, God help us, are mean. And it's true that Jesus said, do not judge that you be not judged. But did He really mean by that, do not make any morally discriminating judgment? Is that what He meant? Why then does He give so many injunctions about telling the truth? Doesn't that stand as an implicit judgment on liars? About loving your neighbor as yourself? That's an implicit judgment on those who don't. About loving God with heart and soul and mind and strength? That too is a condemnation of those who don't. In fact, in the very text where Jesus says, do not judge, lest you be judged, He goes on to say, just 5 verses later, do not cast your pearls before swine. Which means somebody's got to figure out who the pigs are. In other words, when Jesus says something as important as judge not that you be not judged, there are always contexts. He is an astonishingly moral figure. So if what people think judge not that you be not judged means is that Jesus is abolishing all immorality and leaving it all up to you, they haven't even begun to understand who Jesus is. Jesus does condemn the kind of judgment that is judgmental, self-righteous, hypocritical. He condemns that repeatedly and roundly. There is no way on God's green earth He is condemning moral discernment and priority. And that means when we think of God's love, we need to think of God's other attributes too. God's love, true, and His holiness. I will say more about that a little later in the series. His truthfulness, His glory, His manifestation of His spectacular being and loveliness. We'll say more about that yet. But precisely because our culture finds it relatively easy to believe that God is a God of love, in fact, I think we have developed some pretty spongy notions of love.